So that is one aspect of what is going on. But of course, that is not really the heart of this. Yes, there's always the monetary aspect, but the monetary aspect is just used to keep the lower level middle manager gophers of this larger agenda in the game. Why are they in it? Well, maybe for their own crass financial purposes. But what is the game really about? It isn't really about the money, which we know is created out of nothing by the banksters themselves. So that isn't really what this is about. What it is about, of course, ultimately is power and consolidation of control, centralization of control in the coming regional/global governmental system that we know is being worked on and has been being worked on for generations. But how does Iran play into that? Well, in order to understand that, we have to understand how we came to this spot in history. Because guess what? The Iran strikes and what's going on didn't start on Saturday. It didn't start last June with the 12-day war. It didn't start a few years ago. It didn't start with the JCPOA. It didn't start at the beginning of the 21st century. It started, well, arguably, I guess we could go back through thousands of years of history to the old ancient Persian people and the great Persian Empire, and we could talk about what Hegel called the world's first historical people and all of that. But we don't have to go quite that far, or at least we're not going to in today's podcast. What we can do is go back to when Iran very, very squarely came on the geopolitical chessboard. And as viewers of How and Why Big Oil Conquered the World will know, that, of course, took place in 1901. Another global competitor to the Standard Oil throne emerged in Iran at the turn of the 20th century. In 1901, millionaire socialite William Knox D'Arcy negotiated an incredible concession with the King of Persia: exclusive rights to prospect for oil throughout most of the country for 60 years. After 7 years of fruitless search, D'Arcy and his Glasgow-based partner, Burma Oil, were ready to abandon the country altogether. In early May of 1908, they sent a telegram to their geologist telling him to dismiss his staff, dismantle his equipment, and come back home. He defied the order, and weeks later, struck oil. Burma Oil promptly spun off the Anglo-Persian Oil Company to oversee production of Persian oil. The British government took 51% majority control of the company's shares in 1914 at the behest of Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, and survives today as BP. Yes, as viewers of the Big Oil documentary will know all too well, the cementing of the oil world order in the late 19th/early 20th century completely reconfigured the global geopolitical chessboard and made certainly formerly neglected slices of the geopolitical pie, like Iran, somewhat more interesting and important and flavorful for the would-be eaters of the Anglo-American Empire, to really extend that metaphor. And you will know that, for example, the Anglo-Persian/Anglo-Iranian/BP interests in Persia were at least part of what cemented the opposition to the proposed Berlin-Baghdad railway in the lead up to World War I, which was contributory to the World War I conspiracy. But let's skip ahead in this story to the 1950s, when viewers of False Flags, The Secret History of Al-Qaeda, will know Iran, of course, attempted to nationalize the oil, tried to take a greater stake in its own geoeconomic interests, which was, of course, a no-no that was met with fierce and immediate deep state opposition. In March 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the British oil giant that struck oil near the Persian Gulf in 1908, and offered the premiership of the government to Mohammad Mossadegh, an outspoken secular nationalist. Immediately after taking office, Mossadegh effected the nationalization, stating, "Our long years of negotiations with foreign countries have yielded no results this far. With the oil revenues, we could meet our entire budget and combat poverty, disease, and backwardness among our people." Another important consideration is that by the elimination of the power of the British company, we would also eliminate corruption and intrigue, by means of which the internal affairs of our country have been influenced. Once this tutelage has ceased, Iran will have achieved its economic and political independence. The nationalization put Tehran on a collision course with London. But Britain knew that a military intervention was not possible without American approval, and, despite harsh economic sanctions on the country and a boycott of the newly nationalized oil industry that was joined by much of the Western world, They could not overthrow the Iranian government themselves. Instead, they had to turn to the US. Although the Truman administration was initially hesitant to become involved, that changed with the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower and the installation of the Dulles brothers, Alan and John Foster, as Director of Central Intelligence and Secretary of State, respectively. By June of 1953, the CIA was already adapting the British coup proposal into their own covert operation, dubbed Operation TP Ajax. An open secret in the world of intelligence, the CIA MI6 role in the overthrow of Mossadegh was officially denied by the US government for over half a century, and is still unacknowledged by the British government to this day. Nevertheless, the CIA's own internal history of the operation, first revealed to the public in the year 2000, confirms the extent of the American and British role in the coup. They convinced the Shah of Iran to agree to the plan. They handpicked General Fazlollah Zahedi as Mossadegh's successor. They rolled out a propaganda campaign to portray Mossadegh, a devout adherent to democratic nationalism who rigorously excluded the nation's Communist Party from his government, as a communist sympathizer who would steer Iran into the arms of the Soviets. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars bribing journalists, clerics, and even Iranian parliament members themselves to go along with the plot. And they used a network of agents and suitcases full of money to incite riots and protests across the country. In the end, the operation was a success. Mossadegh was driven from power, General Zahedi took his place, the Western-backed Shah ruled the country with the iron fist of his feared secret police for the next 25 years, and a new agreement on sales of Iranian oil was reached. This time, though, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, now rebranded as British Petroleum, would not have a monopoly on the country's lucrative oil reserves. An international consortium was put together to share in the profits, with American companies Chevron and Standard Oil cut into the deal. And yes, you can continue pulling on that historical thread and traveling that historical path through the 1950s and 60s and 70s, through the installation and then the brutal regime of tyranny brought about by the Shah of Iran and his Savak secret police. Again, there's a lot to be told about that tale, and of course, US complicity in that tale, including, of course, the Shah's good personal friend and buddy, David Rockefeller, and what role that might have played in the development of events there in Iran in that time period. But of course, that inevitably leads us to the 1979 Islamic Revolution and the installation of the new Islamic theocracy in Iran and the Ayatollah. And then, of course, it just inevitably follows from there, this seemingly eternal enmity between the US and Iran. Why is the US the great Satan in the Iranian people's imagination? And why is Iran this great boogeyman in the US public imagination? It is because of those events, of those chaotic times, of course, the hostage crisis and everything else that came after that point. And that is why, at least in the minds of many Americans, there is this never-ending hatred of Iran and the Iranian people. There is no doubt that from that time, as I say, Iran became the great boogeyman, and certainly since the 1990s, it has been framed as the great Islamic nuclear threat. Oh, the Islamic bomb. Oh, what if the Iranians get the bomb? The Iranian crazies are working on the bomb. And we have all seen the buildup, the crescendo of nuclear propaganda and hysteria concerning Iran's nuclear program for decades now. Hand-wringing over Iran's nuclear program is nothing new. It became a mainstay of Western political discourse after an Iranian dissident revealed the Iranian government's plans for a uranium enrichment facility in Natanz in August 2002. But the surprising fact for Americans and others around the world who get their information from the corporate mainstream media is that Iran's pre-2003 nuclear weapons program has long been known and admitted. Since 2003, when the program was scrapped, not a single piece of evidence has been presented, not even by Netanyahu or the Israeli government, that the Iranian government ever pursued anything other than what it said it was pursuing, a nuclear energy program. Not that that fact has ever stopped Netanyahu from using any opportunity to use cartoon-level propaganda tactics to convince the world otherwise.
Before Iran completes the second stage of nuclear enrichment necessary to make a bomb, before Iran gets to a point where it's a few months away or a few weeks away from amassing enough enriched uranium to make a nuclear weapon, Now, each day, that point is getting closer. And that's why I speak today with such a sense of urgency.
Of course, Iran was not pursuing nuclear weapons, and Netanyahu's Wile E. Coyote bomb and red line warnings bore no greater semblance to reality than the cartoon propaganda surrounding Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. Not only did the IAEA repeatedly confirm that Iran never diverted any nuclear material into any military program, but even the US intelligence community itself conceded that Iran was not trying to build a nuclear bomb. Most remarkable of all was Mossad's own assessment that Iran was not performing the activity necessary to produce weapons. As I detailed earlier this year in We Need to Talk About the Iran Protests, fear-mongering over Iran's non-existent nuclear weapons program was the basis for an extraordinary series of measures against the country in recent decades. These measures include Nitro Zeus, a full-scale military cyber attack against Iran, the best-known element of which was Stuxnet, the military-grade cyber weapon co-developed by the United States and Israel that specifically targeted Iran's nuclear enrichment facility at Natanz. Iran's non-existent nuclear program also provided the pretext for sanctions aimed at crippling the country's economy, including the delisting of Iranian banks from the SWIFT network, connecting the world's financial institutions. The fearmongers even went so far as to plant evidence of nuclear weapons involvement on Iran to further justify these attacks. But the great irony is that there really is a nuclear-armed nation in the Middle East. It is not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It does not allow inspections of its arsenal. It does not even officially acknowledge its stockpile of nuclear weapons. It has even resisted the push for an international treaty recognizing a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. And that country is Israel. Oh, sorry, spoiler for anyone who hasn't caught my reporting on the real Middle East nuclear threat, but yes, the real Middle East nuclear threat turns out to be not Iran, but Israel, the actual possessor of hundreds of nuclear warheads. No one knows exactly how many, because of course they have never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Their nuclear armaments have never been the subject of any inspection, and in fact, they don't officially exist, or at least everyone pretends to not officially acknowledge Israel's nuclear stockpile. So anyway, and of course, it all came from stolen information from the U.S. nuclear program and materials and goods and parts, etc. I've talked about that many times in the past, so you have some catching up to do if you want to find out more information about that, and you can do so by following the links from corbettreport.com/Iran war. But I think, again, we know how that story goes. The Iranian nuclear threat. Look at Iran and Netanyahu for decades telling the United States, lecturing and hectoring the U.S. public that their mortal existential enemy threat is Iran and Iran's nuclear program. When have I ever lied to you, says Bibi, with a straight face somehow. Now, having said that, there's so much more to talk about with regards to the history that led us to this point, including, of course, the wave after wave of protest movement that just spontaneously arose up in Iran. Yes, there is no doubt that the Iranian people have suffered under their government, as every people around the world suffers under the government to a greater or lesser extent. And there have been protest movements, but there's no doubt also that those protest movements have been fomented and helped along by the propagandists and other deep state operatives in the Anglo-Israeli Empire. And examples of that go back years and years. Remember the Green Movement and the Iranian elections in 2009 and what was happening there? Well, I do, and I had interviews along those lines talking about what was really going on the ground at that time. I had a report on those 2017/18 Iranian protests that were all the rage at that moment. We need to talk about the Iran protests. You might remember that. And we can talk about the many, many examples of the deep state openly musing about how they would engineer some sort of false flag event in order to justify their inevitable strike on Iran. For example, as I documented in 4 times, the U.S. threatened to stage an attack and blame it on Iran, starting, of course, with Patrick Clausen's infamous 2012 lecture on crisis initiation about how, well, we could just sink one of our own subs and blame it on Iran, and who would know? And anyway, we'd be at war.